Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. We all have them, dull old t-shirts hanging in the back of the closet that we need to either donate or throw away. Why not replace them with new vibrant graphic tees from Into the AM, the sponsor of today's video? Into the AM has some of the most amazing graphic tees I've ever seen. I receive compliments on them whenever I go out. They really stand out with their vibrant and expressive designs. My closet was overloaded with old tees that had cracked and faded over the years. I am replacing many of those tees with graphic tees from Into the AM. If graphic tees aren't your thing, Into the AM also has some of the cleanest basic tees to perfectly complement your wardrobe. They support their products with a 30-day money-back guarantee, hassle-free returns, and lightning-fast shipping. And right now, they are having a sale on their graphic tees. Get 25% off from May 11th through the 14th. Now has never been a better time to freshen up your wardrobe with awesome new tees from Into the AM. Use my link in the description and make sure to take advantage of their sale going on now. A big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Nick piloting Send Triplets. This Esper value engine looks to overwhelm the board with great cards from its library as well as its opponent's library. Nick's opening hand contains an Opposition Agent, Windswept Teeth, Forbidden Orchard, Praetor's Grasp, Underground Sea, Notion Thief, and a Mana Crypt. Next, we have Chad piloting Lurrus of the Dream Den. This deck aims to use its commander to recur value from the graveyard until it is able to assemble a combo. Chad's opening hand contains a Gemstone Caverns, Seal of Cleansing, City of Brass, Dark Ritual, Ancient Tomb, Necromancy, and a Praetor's Grasp. After that, we have Alex piloting the partner pair of Tana the Bloodsower and Thrasios Triton Hero. This is a mid-range teamer deck that looks to outvalue the rest of the board until it is able to win, normally with Dockside Extortionist. Alex's opening hand contains a Mana Confluence, Birds of Paradise, Jeweled Lotus, Kin and Bonder Prodigy, Eternal Witness, Jataxian Probe, and a Bloodstained Mire. Finally, we have Drake piloting Esika, God of the Tree. This personal 5-color good stuff deck has many of the typical CEDH win cons and iconic cards in a big pile. Drake's opening hand contains a Ponder, Sleight of Hand, Abundant Harvest, Fate Stitcher, Command Tower, Boseiju Who Endures, and a Mox Diamond. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment about your favorite part of the game. Also be sure to check us out on Twitter, find us on Facebook, and doom scroll our account on TikTok. Without further ado, let's kick off this dastardly deadly daunting duel. Nick remembered the most 90s cartoon theme songs and gets to start us off. But Chad has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Seal of Cleansing. Nick draws a card for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Mana Crypt. He gives the turn to Chad. Chad draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Drake. He searches Drake's library, exclaims his disappointment that Drake recently cut Entomb from his deck, and then exiles a card face down. Chad chips the turn to Alex. Alex draws and pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Nick. He looks at Nick's hand, notably seeing an Opposition Agent, and draws a card. He plays a Bloodstained Mire. He braves the Opposition Agent and then cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He passes the turn. Drake draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Flooded Strand. He casts a Ponder. He looks at the top 3, shuffles, and draws. He casts Sleight of Hand. He looks at the top 2, putting one into his hand and the other on bottom. He ends his turn. At the end of Drake's turn, Nick flashes in an Opposition Agent. During Nick's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with his Opposition Agent. Chad takes it, and Nick passes. Chad draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Doomed Traveler. He passes. Alex draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. He sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus to cast one of his commanders, Tana the Bloodsower. Alex ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Boseiju Who Endures as his land for turn. He casts his commander, Esika, God of the Tree. He ships the turn to Nick. At the end of Drake's turn, Nick casts a Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Windfall onto the top of his library. During Nick's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Opposition Agent. Chad blocks with Doomed Traveler, Traveler dies, and Chad creates a 1/1 Spirit. Nick passes. Chad draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts his commander, Lurrus of the Dream Den. He taps the City of Brass to cast Doomed Traveler from his graveyard through Lurrus. He gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Kennen and Tana. Nick takes the hit, Tana triggers, and Alex creates 2 Saprolines. In his second main phase, Alex pays 2 life to help cast a Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Esika, God of the Tree. Alex ends his turn. Drake draws and casts his own Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts an Abundant Harvest, choosing non-land as it resolves. He reveals the top cards of his library until he reveals a Savine's Reclamation, putting it into his hand. He passes to Nick. At the end of Drake's turn, Nick flashes in a Notion Thief. In response, Drake casts a Manamorphose. He adds a blue and a red and draws a card. Then Thief resolves. The turn goes to Nick. During Nick's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Drake. He searches Drake's library for a card and then exiles it face down. Nick taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving a Spirit to Drake to help cast a Windfall. Thanks to Notion Thief, the table discards their hand and Nick draws 16 cards. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Rhystic Study. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. With the ire of the table in his direction, he passes the turn, discarding to hand size. Chad draws and decides to have Nick face a little payback. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Doom Traveler. Nick takes the hit and Chad gives the turn to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, he activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, failing to find. He draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He ships the turn. Drake draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Esika and Kinnan. Nick takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Drake flashes back Past in Flames. He flashes back Sleight of Hand, looking at the top 2, putting one into his hand and the other on bottom. He flashes back Abundant Harvest, choosing non-land and then revealing until he reveals a Mystic Remora, putting it into his hand. He passes the turn. At the end of Drake's turn, Nick taps his Talisman of Dominance to help cast a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. During Nick's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He casts Silence. Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. He casts a Phantasmal Image, entering as a copy of Kinnan. He casts a Mnemonic Betrayal, exiling his opponent's graveyards. He casts a Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hands and graveyards into their library, and because of Notion Thief, Nick draws 28 while his opponents draw nothing. He casts Chad's Dark Ritual from exile, adding 3 black. He casts Alex's Jeweled Lotus from exile. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He casts Alex's Jitaxian Probe from exile. He looks at Alex's hand and draws a card. He taps his Talisman of Dominance to cast Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, he cracks his Jeweled Lotus, creating an additional black mana with Kinnan, and using that extra mana to cast Demonic Consultation. Consort resolves, Nick names Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Nick wins the game. With a really fun Thoracle finish wrapping up the game, the gang decides to move on to another. Chad brings back Lurrus of the Dream Den, and his opening hand contains Diabolic Intent, Demonic Tutor, Dark Ritual, Chromatic Sphere, Polluted Delta, Mana Confluence, and an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. Alex brings back the partner pair of Tana the Bloodsower and Thrasios, Triton Hero, and his opening hand contains a Wheel of Misfortune, Birthing Pod, Xantid Swarm, Mana Crypt, Tropical Island, and his very interesting London mulligans are Dockside Extortionist and Underworld Breach. Drake brings back Esika, God of the Tree, and his opening hand contains a Force of Will, Thassa's Oracle, Ranger Captain of Eos, Deathrite Shaman, Breeding Pool, Bayou, and a Wooded Foothills. Nick brings back Sen Triplets, and his opening hand contains a Mana Crypt, Aven Mind Sensor, Demonic Consultation, Dothy Voidwalker, Glimmer Void, Mystical Tutor, and a Forbidden Orchard. And Chad gets to start us off. Chad draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Chromatic Sphere. He sacrifices it to add a black and draw a card. He casts a Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to cast his commander, Lurrus of the Dream Den. He recasts Jeweled Lotus from his graveyard through Lurrus. Chad passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He pays 2 life to help cast a Birthing Pod. The table takes notice of this game-ending card, and Alex ships the turn to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Breeding Pool, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Deathrite Shaman. He gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mana Crypt. He ends the turn. Chad draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Jet Medallion. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Lurrus. Alex takes the 3 and Chad gains 3. Chad passes. During Alex's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. Alex draws and casts a Xantid Swarm. He casts a Grim Monolith. Alex ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land from his graveyard and adding a white. He casts a Ranger Captain of Eos. In response, Nick flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Ranger Captain enters, and Drake searches the top 4 through Mind Sensor. He fails to find, and then ships the turn to Nick. During Nick's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Dothy Voidwalker. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Aven Mind Sensor. Chad takes the hit, and Nick gives the turn to Chad. Chad draws and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Lurrus. Nick takes the hit, and Chad gains 3. In his second main phase, Chad casts a Chromatic Sphere from his graveyard through Lurrus. He passes. During Alex's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts a Bloom Tender. Alex ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Bayou. He activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Nick's Verdant Catacombs from his graveyard and adding a white. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand and adding a green. He casts the Prismatic Bridge. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Ranger Captain. Nick takes the hit, and Drake ships the turn. During Nick's upkeep, he loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Glimmer Void. He passes. Chad draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He ends his turn. During Alex's upkeep, he wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts a Rhystic Study. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Xantid Swarm. Swarm triggers, locking out Drake from casting spells this turn. In his second main phase, Alex taps his Bloom Tinder to cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He gives the turn to Drake. During Drake's upkeep, Prismatic Bridge triggers. He reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals an Esper Sentinel, putting it onto the battlefield. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Rhystic Study triggers and Alex draws. He casts a Mana Vault. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws again. Drake passes. At the end of Drake's turn, Nick casts a Mystical Tutor. He pays for both Esper Sentinel and Rhystic Study, then fetches up a Demonic Tutor onto the top of his library. During Nick's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor, paying for Esper Sentinel and Rhystic. He fetches up a card into his hand and then ships the turn to Chad. Chad draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Lurrus. Alex takes the hit and Chad gains 3. In his second main phase, Chad plays an Arid Mesa. He casts a Mana Crypt, paying for Esper and Rhystic. Chad ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Xantid Swarm. Swarm triggers, locking out Drake this turn. In his second main phase, Alex casts a Winds of Rebuke targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Esper Sentinel triggers and Drake draws. In response, Nick casts an Offer You Can't Refuse targeting Winds of Rebuke. Esper Sentinel triggers, and in response, Drake activates his Sensei's Divining Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Drake then draws with Esper Sentinel, an Offer You Can't Refuse counters Winds of Rebuke, and Alex creates 2 treasures, and then Winds of Rebuke is exiled with a Void counter through Dauthi Voidwalker. Next, Alex plays a Taiga as his land for turn. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Dauthi Voidwalker. He casts a Wheel of Misfortune. Each player secretly chooses a number. Nick and Chad choose 0, Alex chooses 7, and Drake chooses 14. Drake takes 14 damage, then Drake and Alex discard their hands and draw 7. Wheel of Misfortune, Force of Negation, Thassa's Oracle, Force of Will, Simian Spirit Guide, and Mana Confluence are all exiled with void counters on them. Alex passes the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Drake activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. During Drake's upkeep, the Prismatic Bridge triggers and he reveals from the top until he hits a Ignoble Hierarch, putting it onto the battlefield. He then activates his Sensei's Divining Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He draws for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Noble Hierarch to match his other Hierarch. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Drake moves to combat and attacks Nick with the Ranger Captain of Eos. Both Hierarchs Exalted trigger, Ranger Captain gives +2/+2, and then Nick takes the hit. Drake ships the turn to Nick. During his upkeep, Nick loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and wastes no time in casting a Thassa's Oracle. Rhystic triggers and Nick pays. In response, Drake casts a Silence. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. In response, Nick casts Demonic Consultation. Esper triggers and Nick pays. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Demonic Consultation resolves, Nick names Han's Run and exiles his library. Before Silence resolves, Alex responds by casting a Red Elemental Blast targeting Thassa's Oracle. Esper triggers and Drake draws. In response, Nick activates Dauthi Voidwalker, sacrificing it and casting Force of Will from exile, targeting Red Elemental Blast. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws a card. In response, Drake casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Force. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws again. Deflecting Swat resolves and changes the target of Force of Will to Thassa's Oracle. Force of Will resolves, Thassa's Oracle is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and then Red Elemental Blast fizzles. With Silence still on the stack, Chad casts an Ad Nauseam. He pays for Rhystic and Drake draws through Esper Sentinel. In response, Alex casts a Force of Will of his own, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Ad Nauseam. Force of Will resolves, Ad Nauseam is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and with nothing else, Silence finally resolves. With his victory thwarted and unable to cast any more spells, Nick ends his turn. During Chad's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Damn, destroying the metamorphed Dauthi Voidwalker, paying for Esper and Rhystic. Chad sacrifices his Chromatic Sphere, drawing a card and adding a black. He casts a Chromatic Sphere from his graveyard through Lurrus. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Chad ships the turn to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Xantid Swarm. It triggers and, in response, Drake sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos, locking out his opponents of casting non-creature spells this turn, just in case Alex goes for the win. Xantid Swarm's trigger resolves, locking out Drake from spells this turn. In his second main phase, Alex casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He ends his turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Drake activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. During Drake's upkeep, Prismatic Bridge triggers and Drake reveals until he hits a Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, putting it onto the battlefield. Drake then activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He draws and casts Savine's Reclamation, targeting Ranger Captain of Eos in his graveyard. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. In response, Alex casts Intuition, targeting Nick. Esper Sentinel triggers and Drake draws. In response, Chad cracks his Chromatic Sphere, drawing a card and adding a black. He flashes in an Opposition Agent. Ristic triggers, and in response, Drake casts a Mystical Tutor. Ristic triggers, and Alex draws. Mystical Tutor resolves, Drake searches the top 4 through Mind Sensor, failing to find. Still in response, Drake activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Then Ristic's trigger resolves, Alex draws, and Opposition Agent resolves. Then Intuition resolves, and Chad controls Alex's search, but he only searches the top 4 cards of his library through Aven Mind Sensor. He reveals a Polluted Delta, Training Grounds, and a Mox Amber, all exiled with Opposition Agent. Savine's Reclamation resolves and returns Ranger Captain of Eos to the battlefield. It enters, and Chad controls Drake during the search through Opposition Agent, only looking at the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor and failing to find. Next, Drake sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos to lock out opponents of casting non-creature spells this turn. He casts a Faithless Looting. Ristic triggers, Alex draws, then Drake draws 2 and discards 2. He casts a Sleight of Hand. Ristic triggers, Alex draws again, then Drake looks at the top 2 cards, putting one into his hand and then the other on bottom. He plays a Taiga as his land for turn. He casts Banishing Knack, targeting Kinnan. Ristic triggers, and Alex draws. Banishing Knack resolves, and Drake taps Kinnan to return his Mana Vault to his hand. He casts Mana Vault, and Alex draws. Drake casts an Underworld Breach. Ristic triggers, and Alex draws. Drake casts a Wheel of Fortune, and Alex draws again. The table discards their hand and draws 7. Nick attempts to draw from an empty library due to Demonic Consultation, and loses the game. Drake casts Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Opposition Agent. Ristic triggers, Alex draws, and then Opposition Agent is exiled. He casts a Jeweled Amulet, and Alex draws off of Ristic. Drake escapes a Mystical Tutor, and Alex draws again. He fetches up a Brain Freeze onto the top of his library. He activates his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. To build the Storm count, Drake pays 2 life and escapes Noxious Revival. Ristic triggers, Alex draws, and Drake puts Alex's Scalding Tarn from his graveyard onto the top of his library. Drake pays 2 life and escapes Noxious Revival again. Ristic triggers, Alex draws again, and Drake puts Alex's Steam Vents from his graveyard onto the top of his library. Drake casts a Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. Ristic triggers, Alex draws, and then Drake mills 51 cards. Drake escapes a Mox Diamond. Ristic triggers, and Alex draws. Diamond resolves, and Drake discards a Tropical Island. Drake escapes a Mox Opal, and Alex draws again. Drake escapes a Lotus Petal, and then Alex draws. Drake escapes a Brain Freeze, targeting Alex, milling his entire library. Alex draws from Ristic, and then mills his entire library. Drake escapes a Brain Freeze again, this time targeting all at Chad. Then Chad mills his entire library. Drake passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Drake wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great pair of games this evening. Congrats to Nick and Drake on their wins. In Game 1, Nick was able to draw an insane amount of cards, leave the rest of the table empty-handed, then finish off the game with classic Thassa's Oracle combo. In Game 2, Drake was able to bide his time and accrue value until he was able to fight through a Ristic Study to a Brain Freeze win. The most valuable card in tonight's games, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Notion Thief. In Game 1, Nick was able to utilize this salty card along with Wheels to make sure he was always far ahead on card advantage, leading to his win. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.